Today, Dan Ingalls of SSL and his father, Professor Daniel Ingalls of Harvard University, will be giving a talk entitled Sanskrit and OCR. Dan Ingalls is a member of the Learning Research Group at PARC and spends his time at PARC designing and implementing the Smalltalk programming system. Professor Ingalls is the Wales Professor of Sanskrit and Indian Studies at Harvard University. His published work includes books on such topics as Indian logic and translations of Sanskrit court poetry. He is also editor of the Harvard Oriental Series. Professor?
My son Dan and I are engaged in a project that combines historical analysis and computer techniques in a rather original way. He asked me to talk to you about the historical dimension of this project, and afterwards he will describe the manner in which he has used computer techniques to solve these problems. It may be simplest to start with the concrete situation and then work backward to the basic problems and goals of the project. For many years, I have been studying a Sanskrit work called the Mahabharata. This is an immense poem. It's about twice the length of the Bible and just about as various in its contents. It has one great difference from the Bible. It contains no datable events. And so it's been a great puzzle to scholars what parts of it may be earlier and what parts may be later. The presumption is that it was not written by one man and that it was written over a very long period of time. And you see estimates composed between 500 BC and 300 AD. When people have tried to assign certain portions to an earlier period or to a later period, it has been largely on subjective, or at least on grounds that are not provable. Now, it seemed to me a reasonable hypothesis that the earlier portions of this poem were orally composed, that is, composed without the use of writing. And I discovered a number of ways in which you can characterize orally composed Sanskrit and can count up the stylistic characters within a given length of text that point to that conclusion. So I began by hand listing these stylistic characters, and that got very wearisome. Daniel suggested that I use a computer to count them up, so I hired a telex machine, and during one summer vacation I typed out a transcription of 3,032 syllable shlokas of the Mahabharata and told Danny what I wanted to find out, and it produced very interesting results. Actually, I read 3 papers on those results before the American Oriental Society, and they bear out the hypothesis very nicely. There are portions of the Mahabharata that were orally composed, and there are other portions that were not. But to assign each part of this work to its proper chronological layer, you've got to make a concordance of the whole. You've got to have an index of every word that is in the poem. And it became very obvious to me from my summer of typing that long before I got through the Mahabharata, I was going to die of boredom, and there would be no point in the whole project. It was then that Daniel said, well, if you could present the printed text of the Mahabharata to a scanner, and if you could teach that scanner to recognize devanagari script, it's not in Latin script, the printed edition, why, that would save you all the trouble of typing. Now, the problem of getting a computer to recognize the components of a devanagari script are really of a very high order of difficulty. And I will let Danny show you, he will show you later how he has solved that problem. We now have a computer whose recognition is 99.5% correct. And it turns out it's not really worthwhile getting it to do even better than that, because we're going to have to edit in a good many things by hand anyhow. Now, to turn to the underlying problems, let me speak first of Sanskrit and then of the Mahabharata in particular. Sanskrit is a language. The word itself, Sanskritam, means perfected. It's basically, the classical Sanskrit is basically the spoken language of northwestern India of about 600 BC. Its perfection consists in its having been refined by several generations of grammarians. We have older examples of pre-refined Sanskrit that go back to around 1200 BC, and it was those ancient examples that first caught the imagination of Western scholars, particularly when they found that this ancient language belongs to the same language family that English and most of the languages of Europe also belong to. One could have guessed this from certain archaic words. The most archaic words, as you probably know, are for close family relationships or for the numerals. You take father is pater in Latin and pater in Greek and piter in Sanskrit, or brother, which is brata in Sanskrit. You take the numerals, two in English. Old English it was twa, Sanskrit it's dva, three is trayach, and so forth. What has interested me more than this ancient member, than the linguistic fact of the archaism of Sanskrit, is the huge literature which arose in this language in later times. Sanskrit became, culturally speaking, the Latin of South Asia. It spread from northwest India through the whole of India and on into Indonesia. All the oldest inscriptions in Indonesia, Indochina, even as far as Borneo, are written in Sanskrit. And there is an immense literature in this language. All the basic works of Hinduism and of Buddhism. You have vast collections of mythology, ritual, philosophy, the ancient sciences, or what they called sciences. Some of them were very strictly so. The grammar, logic, astronomy, medicine. Practically, well, 95% of what is preserved from India before the Muslim conquest is written in Sanskrit, and it's continued to be written on up to the present. You have, in addition to these rather formidable and serious texts of literature I've been speaking of, you have all the court literature of plays and love poems and tales, of delightful collections of stories. Just to give you a rough indication of what there is, the great catalog of Sanskrit manuscripts is being prepared in Madras now, called the Catalogus Catalogorum. When it's completed, will list well over 1 million Sanskrit manuscripts that are still preserved. And of course, there's a good bit of duplication in that, but even if you got rid of the duplication, you would probably have enough to fill 50 or 60,000 volumes. No, I think I'm all right. Now, one peculiarity of this literature is that much of the ancient portion of it was preserved for many centuries by memory, not in the form of written texts. Again, this often surprises people that large amounts of literature can be preserved by memory, and it also surprises them to know that there have been many centuries when the art of writing was known, but books were not written. And the reason is that to have books written, you need two things. You need the technique of the symbolism of writing, but you also need cheap writing materials. And if you look at the form in which the earliest Sanskrit writings occur, chiseled into stone, it was not an easy way in which to write a poem of 200,000 lines. What finally produced books in India was the discovery of cheap writing materials. They began to use birch bark and particularly palm leaf. And palm leaf gave India its literacy, just as papyrus gave literacy to the Greco-Roman world. Now, there are two ways in which a literature can be preserved by memory. In the case of magical chants or essential rituals, they have to be memorized word by word. And that's the way the Indians memorized the sacred Vedas. And they invented special mnemonic techniques for doing that. They would memorize not only the text straight, but they had systems of memorizing word 1, word 3, word 2, word 4, word 3, word 5. It's extraordinary. They go through 10,000 verses with this kramaparta, this double check on themselves, so that not a single word could be forgotten, not a single accent could be misplaced. But the majority of the literature that was preserved in memory was not preserved in this way. What was memorized was the content, and it was freshly presented each time. This is particularly true of the epic. This Mahabharata I've been speaking of began as an epic, although it ended up as an encyclopedia. Epics are recited in the oral tradition extempore. And the man who first showed that clearly and showed what the techniques are was Milman Parry. His work has been carried on by many people, but most notably by Albert Lord. Milman Parry discovered by listening to living epic poets in Serbia that they never recited one of their epics exactly the same way twice in succession. What they did was to memorize the plots, they memorized the names of all the characters in the epic, and they memorized a large body of formulas. There were formulas or set ways of saying the sorts of things that were likely to turn up frequently, the descriptions that would be needed in the course of their description. And then with this knowledge in hand, they stood up before their audience and they spoke in poetry with as much ease as or probably more ease than I'm speaking to you right now. I've left on that chair there, in case some of you would be interested later on, some handouts that come from a talk 2 days ago at the American Oriental Society. It's meeting in San Francisco right now. And on the first page, and the second page too, you will find a list of some Mahabharata formulas. You can see how the same way of saying things occurs and reoccurs and reoccurs. For example, the one on the front page is for the licking of the lips. This is a situation that occurs when a warrior is taking aim at his enemy. Often he's just been wounded. Regularly he is furious, red-eyed, and frequently a simile is added. I'll give you a translation of the first 4 out of the 40 occurrences that I have there, and you'll see how they all go according to a pattern. The hero licking the corners of his lips like a wolf in the flock. Another one. The hero licking and licking the corners of his lips, his eyes reddened with anger. Or again, licking around the corners of his lips, O king, breathing hard and with eyes red with anger. Again, the hero licking the corners of his lips like a proud tiger. If you have these formulas in the back of your mind, and mind you, they all make good verse, they're all metrical, why, you can talk in poetry about a vast number of things. Now, in order to assign the different parts of the Mahabharata to an early stage and a late stage, it's necessary to count up formulaic instances. It's necessary also to count up the instances of certain types of words in certain positions in the line. In formulaic, in oral poetry, such words as a spondee is a word that contains two long syllables, tend to be polarized to the ends of the line because that's the easy place to put them. Other words like the double I am naturally come at a certain point in this Mahabharata meter, and they will regularly occur there. If you have time enough to write out a first version of what your poem's going to be and then correct it, you can get much more subtle arrangements of words, and you can use spondees, for example, in many situations where they seem difficult, where you won't think of them right away. But when it's an ongoing performance, you naturally choose the easy blocks for the natural places, and this is one of the characteristics that I used to identify the portions that are written in this oral style. Now, why is it really very important to discover what portions of a very ancient poem were made first and what portions were made second? This Mahabharata, it concerns, at least the narrative line, basically a war between two families of cousins over the possession of a kingdom just north of the modern city of Delhi. The heroes of the poem are cheated out of the kingdom. They're forced into exile, and they go through various adventures and hardships. They come back, and there's a long diplomatic correspondence with their opponents, and finally comes the war in which almost everybody is killed. At the end of the war, there is a long lecture on right and wrong and justice and law from old grandfather Bhishma, and finally at the end, they set off to the Himalayas to climb up to heaven. In the course of all of this, you were given the basic texts of Hindu religion. Many of you will have heard of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a poem in which God incarnate tells the chief hero, Arjuna, why it is his duty to fight in the war, although his family, many members of his family and friends are on the opposite side. And he then goes on to speak of the various ways in which a man can perform his duty on earth, or the various ways in which a man can come to know God. In the 12th book, you have the whole basis of what ancient Indians thought was the purpose of life. It would be a fascinating thing if we could understand this poem not as a complete whole in the way in which medieval theologians understood it, but as the sum of a long process. Just as it seems to me fascinating to think of, say, the book of John in the New Testament, not simply as the Word of God, which is to be harmonized completely with all the other Gospels, but if you can see it as the result of Gnostic movements, and you can trace them back, and you can see how the Gnosticism affected Christianity, you begin to get a sense of the movement of ideas, the movement of religions, and you come to have an understanding in depth instead of an understanding that is without any of this historical dimension. That's why I started on the project in the beginning, and I can only thank my good karma, as the Indians would say, for having had a son that was able to help me do the thing that I want to do. Now, two things make this making of a concordance difficult. Even after you have a computer that can recognize the system of writing in which the critical text of the Mahabharata is printed. The Sanskrit language is a language which makes very numerous euphonic changes between words. We have them in all languages to some extent. In English, they are not written, but you are aware of them. If you say, "Did you light the stove?" the pronunciation of "you" is one. But if you say, "Why'd you light the stove?" it's quite a different pronunciation. You get "why'd you," you get the J in there. Now, in Sanskrit, all of these small differences must be written in, so that if you say "having heard it," and you put the "having heard" first, the thing.
Wrong way.
Okay. The "having heard" is shrutvatat, but if you reverse the words, it becomes tat shrutva. And it is changes of this sort that give the language a very amorphous aspect. As any of my Sanskrit students will tell you, they spend the first year trying to figure out what word is what. If you take, well, we take any nominative plural. We'll take the word for brothers because it happens to be like the English one. Brataras. Now, if I want to say the brothers are standing, this is the form that brataras takes. Brataras tishtanti. But if I want to say that they are walking, it changes to bratarash charanti. If I want to say they're throwing a ball or something, this changes to brataraha shipanti. I'll just only write the beginning of it. If I want to say that they're running, it changes to an O, brataro tavanti. If I want to say they're looking at me, it changes to an A, bratara ikshanti, ikshanti, and so forth. The words assume many forms. And when you combine this with the fact that you have 8 cases of the noun in the singular, dual, and plural, it makes quite a lot to recognize at the beginning. Now, there's a problem in the writing of the script in which Sanskrit is written. The text that we are using is published in Devanagari, which is the commonest of the Indian scripts now used. It's the script that's used for Hindi and Marathi, as well as for publications in Sanskrit. And it, as well as all other alphabets, well, they aren't alphabets, as well as all other systems of writing now used in India, is basically a syllabary rather than an alphabet. I can show you how it works. We take the syllables that begin with K. For simple K-A, short A is the unmarked vowel. You have this sign. If you have a long A, you get a stroke after it. If you have a short I, if you have a long I, and so forth. If you have a ku, but you write a word syllable by syllable. So if I were to write Mahabharata, I will write it, I'll do it on top so as you can see, syllable by syllable. This is ma, ha, ba, ra, ta, right? Now, when two consonants come together, you have to make a ligature, for instance, if you have bratara for brothers, it begins BHR. You've got to combine the BH with another sign. Actually, this is R and this is RA. They don't look very much alike. BHR is a special ligature of these two. Now, when you write a sentence, if I were to write, say, this is the beginning of a famous story. There was a king, Nulla by name, Nullo Namo. The only place where you have a break in the type is where the prior word ends in a vowel and the next word begins in a consonant. Otherwise, the thing will be written solid. If you're transcribing this says there was, Asi, Raja is a king, Nulla by name. But you've got to write this, the Asi solid. So it just looks like a single word. Now, when you put a computer to reading that, it will come out in transliteration like this, with a space here and a space here. In our concordance, we want all the words that are in the Mahabharata. We want all the components of compounds that are in the Mahabharata. And so we will have to edit in the word breaks. And it's fairly simple to do in this case. You just move this over. But where you have two vowels that coalesce, it gets to be complicated, because you have a thing like as if of him, tasya iva, because of the rules of euphony, appears as tasyeva. Now you've got to point your mouse at this and have it dissolve this into A plus I. But in some cases, such an E vowel will result from a long A plus short I, in some cases from a short A plus a long I, from some cases from a long A plus a long I. So you've got these four possibilities. Well, I think maybe I've talked enough about the difficulties. I think we better get to the fellow who solved them. Here, you want this, Danny?
I'm going to be over here. Can people hear that? Okay. Is there a volume control here? Okay, how's that? Great. Can we have the lights off? Because I'm going to do this mostly all with slides, and I think that the lights will just be an interference. Yes, I can. Should I turn this back down?
Hey, you want this, don't you?
No. Oops, this comes with lots of stuff. Yeah. Are you going to turn off the light? Because it's real hard for me to see with the screen. When I looked at the problem of how we could transliterate the Devanagari script, the first thing to do is to find a scanner. And at that time, Jasmine's weren't around. And Bob Hunt had just modified the TC200 telecopier so that it could feed its information into an Alto. And so here is a picture of the TC200. And this is for another audience that hasn't seen Altos. There's a picture of the Alto. And they're cabled together. And what you basically get, the TC200 scans a page of text at 240 dots per inch resolution. So that's about twice the width of a human hair per dot, which seems real fine until you start looking at text, and you'll see many examples following how the text looks. But it really turns out to be quite workable. And the page of text comes in and gets put on the disk, and then it can be worked on by programs. And I've done all of my work in the Smalltalk system just to make it easy to try it out. And it runs real slow, but it's provided an opportunity to actually solve the problem. This is the text that we're working with. And here's a typical page. And I wanted to show you this just to show you that there's
there's a significant part of the problem is simply locating the lines of text on the page. You see, you've got page headings, which you don't care about, and then here comes the text that you do care about. It's in two-column format, and then there's this little fiducial down here, and then commentary below that. And in addition, just to make things interesting, there are these little squiggles here under things, and they relate to footnotes here, where there are alternative interpretations, because this is a critical text, so it includes several different sources. Now, the two-column format also is worse because you get these breaks between chapters where this is column 1 and it completes there, and then the next chapter begins here, column 1 and column 2. So you have to deal with all that page layout. But that's, I mean, you just do it and then it's done. This is an example of the text after it's been scanned in. And you can see, now here you can see the devanagari, how it looks when it's printed. And the first task in getting on with character recognition is to locate the lines on the page. So I do this by taking a thin, one of the primitives that just gets used again and again in the process of doing this image recognition. And this is probably different from what you would do. Well, you might do the same thing in grayscale work. But with text that's just black or white, make up a thin rectangle and count the number of dots that are black in it. And that allows you to decompose pictures. So the first thing I do is to make a thin rectangle, which is a slice across the page, and then actually not across the page, across the column. And then move it down the page, each time counting up the number of dots on in it. And that gives you a profile that's like this on the left. Okay, so here I've plotted a black area that's as long as the number of dots there. So you can see that these glumps are the lines with essentially 0 counts in between. That then allows you to take a look at an individual line. You can then take a thin slice vertically and run that horizontally across the line, and you'll find these 0 counts between the actual words, the words that are shown. Where they do show, right. So that will allow you to locate the first word. And then you can repeat the process on this to come down with another thin slice vertically through here. See, the page may not be perfectly horizontal, or even if it is, the type probably won't be, because these are all pretty much manually typeset. So you do this again, and that allows you to find this horizontal bar. It's called the matra. And you can recognize that by this peak. And once having recognized that, you can then take a look at the 2 separate boxes which represent the area where most of the consonants are, and this area above where the vowel inflections are. And what I've done here in this picture is to show you the result of then going through the lower area and getting its weight. So here you actually see the breaks between the characters here. This happens to be a nice example. They're all 0 in between. And then on the top here also for those 2 characters. And the final result then is to draw boxes around them, and you scan down within a character. You go down until you find that it's all white, and that allows you to draw the bounding box. So then the next thing you have to do is to now what you've got is you've got the right dots, and you have to figure out what the dots are. So the way that I tackled this problem was to have a model which would learn the set, the type, the font in which the text was set. And the way I've done that is you go through and box a bunch of characters, and then you manually identify them. And the model that I've chosen for representing the characters is what I call a skin and bones model. When you see the first, this is the glyph for ta. When you see the first one, that becomes the only thing you know about it. When you see another example of it, then what you can do is basically OR them together and AND them together. In other words, here you produce an image which is black where either of them may be black, and this one here is black where they both are black. And you continue that with successive examples that you encounter see, this one was slurred over at the bottom. It doesn't show the break. So in the skin, you have to allow for the case that there will be black in there. And similarly, the bones has got this little nick there. And it's interesting. You learn about the actual pieces of type that they had, because and Dad took quite a while in the beginning of this project figuring out a dictionary of all the ligatures, that is the combined characters that were used in this font. And in fact, the program just discovered them automatically. That was very gratifying. Now here are a couple of unknowns about to be recognized. These are two tus, and this one you'll see is broken. It doesn't matter too much. And there's a process that has to go on before you actually do the scoring, which is that you have to align the incoming unknown character with respect to the master representation. And so let's see, this may be a little bit confusing, but this started out with all the 9 possible alignments. Okay, laying it straight over, or shifting it by 1 this direction, shifting it by 1 that direction, and so on. And so it tried all those alignments, and of all those, it liked this one best. And so having liked this one better, it went on to check the ones adjacent to it, and it liked this one even better. The dots here are the ones where they differed, just by a simple exclusive OR. And then having liked this one better, it checked out these 3. And you see here it's shifting over too far. You're getting black areas on the side. And so this was selected as the final correct alignment.
Exclusive OR of the stimulus with skin or with
Well, it doesn't matter. This is what I actually do is to compare both the skin and the bones, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I just did this picture with an exclusive OR so you could see the alignment. Well, I will talk about it right now. The way that I finally score the things is that it's bad if an unknown has a dot on where the skin does not have a dot on, because that's lying outside of the region where most of those characters do have black. And similarly, it's bad if a character is missing something that has a white place where the bones has a black place, because that means it's missing something which you encountered in all the ones that you identified. And then you just add those 2 scores, and I don't know why I got into this negative view of things, but that's how bad it is, so the lowest score wins.
You worry about rotations? Or is it
I do not worry about rotations. I don't even do them.
does that hurt
No.
you?
No. They're all pretty much straight. And if 1 in 1,000 got really skewed, that would be okay. I mean, we're willing to tolerate a few errors. Now here's an example of an incoming unknown to be recognized. It is a ta. And it gets compared. Here's the skin and the bones first of all, there's an initial process where you say, is this reasonably close to one of the masters? And that involves a check on the size of the bounding box, and also on a quick version of this scoring without any test for alignment. And these were the winners. So you can see that they're sort of similar. This is a na, this is a ta-ta, and so on down here. They all look somewhat like it. And here's the result of finding the bits that were on here but not on in the skin. So that's bad. And similarly, these are the ones that were not on here that were on in the bones. And so there it is for each of these. And the final one, which was it's kind of poorly focused, which is the correct one, you'll see there's just a couple of dots there and 1 there. So that won. And that's how it works. So then you end up with the word or segment with the characters identified with their correct transliteration. And then there's a further process that goes on, which is basically putting together the way that the vowels are spread around the syllables, so that here, this upper glyph, which represents either an O or an E, this part of the program is very heuristic. I did it in a hurry, and it's not actually done uniformly, but it does the correct thing. This top piece together with that bottom piece ends up making effectively an A, effectively an E, and that together with the A-ness that's in this makes effectively an O. And similarly, this M dot thing here gets put on the end. And it's really been fun doing this because, you know, computers inside them don't have any idea of what you're doing. And, and I'm in that relationship to this project, you know. This is just a piece of the Smalltalk code, and I actually won't say anything about it except that, you know, this is the part for doing that transliteration, and it's just a bunch of, you know, special cases. If the top part contains an O part of the glyph, then do thus and such. And so this is another place where there's just a bunch of special cases similar to the dealing with the page layout. This is the character layout. Here's another example. It just shows a bit more of what you have to do. You get these compound glyphs. This is an R hook, and this is an I hook. And this I hook goes with this piece, and this R hook goes actually before this consonant, sort of in there. And you can figure that out by the horizontal coordinates. So in that case, see this R hook, it got figured out that it went before the R, and that this piece here ended up making an I here, and so it goes. And so that allows you to get the, let's see, I've got some stuff in here about just various difficulties that arose. This is a ba, and this is a ma. And you'll see they're almost identical. If you're lucky with the ba, it's missing this little piece there. But often you're not, and so they look almost identical. And they can look identical, or at least you can't tell them apart. However, if you're lucky, the ba will always have a broken matra up here. So there's some special rules in there for checking for that in certain cases.
Is that an idiosyncrasy of the type? Is that what you're talking
You mean that? Yes.
about? The broken matra?
Yeah.
No, that should
That should be there. Right. I see. Yes. And then there are things that get put together. For instance, this is the hook of the T, and this is a ya. So this together means tya. And by my simple algorithm, I can't split those apart. And so for cases like that, and in fact, it's sort of reasonable that I can't because that was a single type slug. So we just augment the alphabet, and that makes it very simple. Then there's another problem that comes up here, which is that although it is a separate piece of type, the ligatures that have this long U vowel still are kerned underneath the next character. And that, for the simple boxing, that screws things up. So what I did was I just basically did the boxing only down to such a level that would typically not include the kerning of the U. And that turned out to not degrade the recognition because this big glump here was still pretty characteristic of a long U, and yet allowed the boxing to work properly. And let's see, what's this? That's just another example. Oh yeah, here's a kind of thing that can go wrong, which is this is a representation of basically KTA, but it's written in a kind of a funny way. If you look at this glyph separately, and in this case the program thought that it was separate, this represents a TTA and this a KA. No, just a K, I guess. And so I had to put in a special rule. It would be impossible to have TTK. So when you see those two things together, it undoes it, knowing what it should have been. So you end up with the transliteration as desired. Now, as my father explained to you, for the purposes of the concordance, you want to break down the segments of type further into the actual word breaks. And this is, so I've just got a couple of slides showing that. And basically there, I'll just zip through it. Here, this O, you select, and then you indicate the kind of break. Is this a stem break?
It's within a compound.
Right, that's the break between two stems in a compound. And that got split up into an AU. And, and similarly here, this got broken up. There was no splitting of the vowel there. And so you just continue in this process. Here there was an actual word break there. And here I'm just going to hold on to the whole schmear. Great, thanks. And here's the long A to be broken up. And in this case, the second A wants to be lengthened. So that's taken care of basically by having a couple of keys on the key set, which you push down. And you push the one on the left if you want the left vowel lengthened, and the one on the right if you want the right vowel lengthened at the time that you indicate the break. And then also you get errors. Like here, there was a question mark. It couldn't recognize something. And you're lucky if you get a question mark. Usually what you just get is the wrong thing. So you get to select that and replace it with the correct characters. And let's see. Oh, I've got a couple of these slides are where they shouldn't be. Just a second. This thing is going backwards. It's about the equipment here. I'm about to get there.
You can position it where you want.
Yeah. Okay. Just a second. Well, I'm just gonna stop and say a couple of things, which is that takes care of getting the transliterated text, and there's some other work that's been done here, which I think is kind of exciting, which is Chris Jeffers, who worked in Nepal in the Peace Corps, made essentially a Devanagari typewriter at one point in the Smalltalk system, and I think that could be refined on. It's interesting that it's quite costly right now, or difficult to set Devanagari type, and as a result, there's either there are small amounts of it available or it's low quality, and I think that there's something that could be done. For instance, any of this stuff, once scanned in, could be reprinted in really high quality if you wanted to do that. And also, Yogan Dalal knows something about that. So if anybody's interested in that stuff, they could talk to those people. I then took, I thought it would be interesting to see how these algorithms would work on English text. And so I did that for a couple of samples of English text. And I'm just going to persist here for a minute and try and get the slides, because the slides will show that nicely. So bear with me. I just know that there's a slide in that region. Yeah.
Just
Uh-huh.
start at 0, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's working. All right. We'll go by tens. Okay, that's working. Okay. Ray. Well, that's really surprising. Well, I will just tell you how the English stuff worked, which is that I took a really junky piece of type. It was actually, it was nice text, but scanned in very poorly. It was a letter that my father sent me, and it was typed on erasable bond with a poor typewriter. And for that, it got about, let's see, I wrote it down. I've kind of forgotten. It was a sample of 2,700 characters, and it missed 50. So that gives you about 98% accuracy. So I thought that was pretty good. And it was also fun looking through that, because in the process, it didn't do too well for several things. And as a result of fixing those, it improved things for the Sanskrit as well.
How many characters went to make up the skin and bones in each character?
I've just been using 4. And I was going to go to more, but whenever the examples are poor, what happens is the bones just get totally depleted and don't do much good. But that definitely was responsible for some of the problem with that piece of text. And so then I took a nice clean piece of text, and it was printed in Gotcha 10 here, and scanned that in. and that out of a sample of 5,700 characters missed 5. So it's 0.1%. It's just totally usable. It goes fairly slow. It goes glacially in Smalltalk. But basically all the operations are done with this primitive here called bitblit, and so that it can run quite fast. And we definitely plan to speed that all up with when we start reading in these 200,000 verses.
Try it on the Dorado.
I did. It goes much faster on the Dorado. And so just the bitblit times on an Alto would have it be around 7 minutes for a page of the Devanagari script. And the TC200 takes about 10 or 20 seconds per page. So there's an additional factor there of 10 or 20 that you'd like to pick up. And what I would like to do, it's the actual recognition stuff for given a line of text is a really small piece of program together with the table of the skin and bones. And I thought it would be really fun to just write that little piece of program in a way that it could be squirted out over the ether. That's something that connects all the computers. So that you could then just, when you read in a page of text, you could just send the lines of text out to each of these machines. They would recognize the characters in them. Then you could go pull them around and get the results, all in about the time it took to scan the page.
Useful worm.
That's right, a useful worm. So that summarizes what I had to tell you, and we'd both be happy to entertain questions. Yeah?
Can you do the word division automatically?
No, we just had a very interesting talk with Martin Kay and Ron Kaplan today about that. And from the text that my father typed in manually, we have there is a sample body of text that has already had that done. And so we're going to provide that to him with and without the appropriate splitting and see if it's easy to discover simple things to do. Yeah?
Given that you get the horizontal and vertical profile projections during your process, have you tried using them as either confirming information or sort of presetting information to narrow down the search space?
No, not really. The box around the character is. That limits it. And my sense is that, no, the answer is no. And that's something you could do, and it would be interesting to do that.
It seems to speed up the document.
That's right. Well, it comes down to the statistics of where the program spends its time, and that's still sort of artificial because of the extra level of simulation, and that's something that would be really worth looking at when we get into production. Yeah?
Is there any correlation between the number of dots in a character and its phonetic relation?
I don't know. The number of dots in a character is definitely a feature you can use for early rejection. My father says no. Yeah?
What were the couple of things you had to fix up when it was not English?
One of the things was that just taking the two bad features left out, it's sort of appropriate, there should also be basically a reward for the good bits. And that became significant when I started working on this really poor example of typing, because the bones just got to be totally depleted, and it would not recognize well. So including that additional piece of information takes a little bit longer, but it makes it about twice as good.
So it was not a function of it being English, but only
That's right.
low quality input.
Yeah, it was a flaw in the initial way of doing things, yeah. Yeah?
When you get into production, is it your idea that the program that's going to be squirted out will be written in microcode or in BCPL or something like that, Mesa, and then you'll still have Smalltalk in charge?
Yeah, I don't know where Smalltalk will remain. Certainly for stuff such as learning the font can remain in Smalltalk, because that doesn't enter into the production process at all. My guess is that everything else will want to be BCPL or Mesa, just because it's got to go fast. And or Smalltalk may get faster. Yeah.
Have you looked at other
The Kurzweil is mostly a feature-driven. I just had a brief conversation with one of their guys. Mostly a feature-driven thing. They do something similar to this when in their learning process if the feature thing gets confused. And then I think that there's been some other work that has a representation similar to the skin and bones. And I basically didn't know anything about how people did this, and I still don't know much about it. But I think it's a valid technique, but I don't think it's as fast as some others. And I think that for any of these things, you really need hardware if you want to go at the kinds of useful speeds that people would want in an office. Yeah?
How long do you anticipate it will take to get the whole text done?
Well, we were thinking about a year, and that was without the assumption that there would be a program to help with the breaks. In other words, it should take a little bit longer to insert the breaks than to basically read it slowly. And my father figured that over the course of a year he could do that. Again?
This is sort of a question for your father. Once you've gotten that output, how long will it take you to complete your research on getting the concordance done and that sort of to get the answers that you're
after the concordance is done, how long will it take?
Well, I mean, once you get the output, will that give you, that is the concordance? I mean, the
Yes,
output of
that
the
is the
program?
concordance. Then, well, okay.
Are you going to have to go blind sitting at a terminal for a long time to get to that point?
Oh, no, I think we'd get it printed so that you could have it on your desk.
I see.
Well, it could take, you could keep working at it a long time. I mean, I will get the direct answers I wanted pretty quickly, but then there are all kinds of refinements you can make, and there's material here for other people to go on with for a very long while. If I can get the main assignment of proportions to chronological layers so that I can write a history of the genesis of the word, that's what I want to do. Then other people can go on for a century.
I think that's it.